This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nazeh Hall, and it's time for another MTG Top 10, the series where I rank cards based on their historical performance and Magic's highest level of competition. Today we're going to look at Dinosaurs. The next standard release set is the Lost Caverns of Ixalan, and Ixalan is a plane with a whole bunch of dinosaurs, so I thought it would be interesting to take a look at them ahead of the set's release. This isn't the first time I've done a top 10 on dinosaurs. I did it for the first time back in March of 2020, but the list has undergone significant change over the last 3+ years. The dinosaur creature type has sort of a strange history. It actually appeared very early on in the game on a card called Pygmy Allosaurus from Ice Age, but then at some point Wizards decided the dinosaur creature type didn't really fit in this game, so they retroactively removed the creature type and changed everything that was a dinosaur to a lizard, so that a later card like Imperiosaur, which is pretty dinosaur looking, was given the lizard creature type and not the dinosaur creature type. Of course, that all changed with Ixalan block, where dinosaur was reintroduced as a creature type and became a heavily supported tribe, and that means that Wizards went back again and returned the Allosaurus to its original creature type and switched a card like Dromasaur to dinosaur. To be eligible for this list, a card had to have the dinosaur creature type or make a dinosaur creature token. In all, there were 140 cards that met this criteria, and in this video we'll look at the 10 that have left the biggest impact on competitive Magic. As always, when I do an update video, I'll also take a look at the cards that made the list last time but didn't make it this time. Before we get started, here's a quick reminder on how I score cards in these videos. A first tier top 8 is worth 2 points. This includes events like Pro Tours, and a second tier top 8 is worth 1 point. This includes events like regional championships. Alright, let's get started with a look at the 3 dinosaurs who made the 2020 list, but couldn't hang on to a spot this time. Starting with Ripjaw Raptor, which was at number 10 last time. For 2 generic and 2 green, this dinosaur is a 4/5 that draws you a card anytime it's dealt damage. It has some nicely above rate stats, and because of its ability, there are many situations where the best your opponent can do is 2-for-1 themselves. It saw a bit of play in Standard, finding itself in both aggro and control decks, but it never really caught on in a big way, and hasn't gained any points since rotating. It's nowhere near making the list now, as it took 27 points to be the number 10 card this time, so the Raptor is never going to make its way back on the list. Next, there's Snubhorn Sentry, which was at number 9 last time. This dinosaur costs 1 white mana and it gives you a 0/3. It comes with Ascend, which means that if you control 10 or more permanents, you get the City's Blessing for the rest of the game. And when you have the City's Blessing, the Sentry is a 3/3, and you don't need me to tell you how good a 1 mana 3/3 is. While in Standard, it was featured in white aggro decks that were good at going wide quickly and making the Sentry big even in the early game. It hasn't seen any play since rotating out of Standard, though. Lastly, there's Nazeh Hall Primal Tide, which was at number 6 last time. This 7/7 dinosaur costs 5 generic and 2 blue. It can't be countered. It turns off any limits on your hand size. It draws you a card when your opponent casts a non-creature spell, and you can discard 3 cards to exile Nazeh Hall and return it to the battlefield at the beginning of the next end step. This combination of abilities makes it pretty hard for your opponent to effectively interact with Nazeh Hall. If they want to use removal, you're going to be getting a 2-for-1 out of it at the very worst, since you'll draw a card, and if they can remove Nazeh Hall, you can use those extra cards to blink it out to dodge the removal. Nazeh Hall has seen play in control decks in multiple formats, where it's usually a sideboard card that's brought in during mirror matches. It's very difficult for an opposing control deck to beat Nazeh Hall. It's actually only 1 point shy of making the list right now, and there are a few cards in the lower part of the list that aren't that far ahead of it and that aren't that active, so Nazeh Hall might actually make its way back on the list in the future. Alright, let's move to the top 10 now, starting with our number 10 card, Karuga the Macro Sage, a newcomer to the list. The last list came out about a month before Ikoria was released, so Karuga didn't even exist. For 3 generic and 2 blue-green hybrid mana, Karuga is a 5/4 dinosaur, and when it enters the battlefield, you draw a card for each other permanent you control with mana value 3 or greater. Karuga also happens to have one of the most powerful mechanics in the history of the game, Companion. It can be your companion if every card in your deck has a mana value of 3 or greater. Originally, this meant that if you met the requirement, Karuga would start the game in your sideboard and you could cast it from it anytime you'd be able to cast a creature normally. The mechanic had to be nerfed because it was so insane, and now you have to pay 3 generic to put your companion into your hand from your sideboard, and then you have to cast it normally. This still means you effectively start the game with 8 cards in your hand, and that's a pretty tempting reason to meet this requirement. Obviously enough, if you do meet Karuga's requirement, it's going to draw you a card for every non-land permanent you have in play, and that's pretty great, especially if you don't have to try that hard to make it happen. In both Standard and Pioneer, Karuga has been the companion in Fires of Invention decks, which generally have a super high curve without even trying. Karuga is also played as a companion in modern elemental decks, which run elemental incarnations like Fury and Solitude, which make it a lot easier for you to meet the requirement because they give you a way to interact in the early game, even though they cost 3 or more mana. Karuga is going to keep gaining points in Pioneer and Modern, and it's almost assuredly going to keep moving up the list, as there are 3 inactive cards that barely have more points than it does right now, right ahead of it. One of them is our number 9 card, which is Carnage Tyrant, which was at number 4 last time. This dinosaur costs 4 generic and 2 green, and it's a 7/6 with hexproof and trample, and it can't be countered. While it was in Standard, the Tyrant was the worst nightmare of many control decks, since they often have very few creatures in play and rely on being able to deal with most problems with removal and counter magic, but Carnage Tyrant isn't worried about either of those. It ended up providing the top curve for decks like Golgari aggro and midrange, as well as Sultai aggro and midrange. However, since rotating out of Standard, Carnage Tyrant doesn't have a single point, and if I revisit the list in 3 years, it would be very surprising if it was still here. At number 8, it is Death Gorge Scavenger, which was at number 3 last time. Just like in 2020, it and the Tyrant have an identical total score, but Death Gorge Scavenger has more first-tier top 8s, so I gave it the higher slot. The Scavenger costs 2 generic and a green for a 3/2 dinosaur, and whenever it enters the battlefield or attacks, you can exile a card from a graveyard. If you get rid of a creature, you gain 2 life, and if it's a non-creature, the Scavenger gets +1/+1 until end of turn. Hating on the graveyard and getting a decent creature to go with it tends to feel pretty good. It makes it the kind of graveyard hate that doesn't have to start in your sideboard, since the fail case is still a decent card. After all, it can still get value out of exiling stuff from your graveyard. It saw the most play early on during its time in Standard because cards like the Scarab God and God Pharaoh's Gift were running amok in the format, and the Scavenger made life a lot more difficult for those cards. Later on in its time in Standard, it was often relegated to sideboard duty in decks like Gruul and Golgari aggro. Those decks generally wanted more aggressive creatures than the Scavenger, except against opponents who were up to graveyard shenanigans. Like Carnage Tyrant, it hasn't gained any points since rotating out of Standard, and it probably won't be on the list for that much longer. At number 7, it is Deathmist Raptor, which was at number 2 last time. It also happens to be the only card on the list that was only given the dinosaur creature type retroactively, so even though it says Lizard on the card, trust me, it has the dinosaur creature type and has for years at this point. For 1 generic and 2 green, the Raptor is a 3/3 with Death Touch and Megamorph. Megamorph means you can pay 3 generic and play it face down, and then you can pay 4 generic and a green at any time to turn it face up and give it a +1/+1 counter. It also happens to be an incredibly powerful morph payoff because if it's in your graveyard and you turn a creature face up, the Raptor returns directly to the battlefield, either face up or face down. The Raptor helped spawn an entire deck built around the morph mechanic. This green-white Megamorph deck was quite successful in Standard. Having a creature like the Raptor who just refuses to stay dead is a pretty good way to grind out a win, especially when it was combined with the other frightening green Megamorph creature, Den Protector. The two of them provided the deck with serious value, since the Protector turning face up would often return 1 to 2 Raptors to the battlefield, and you'd get another card back from your graveyard into your hand. It was a pretty good inclusion, even in decks that only had 1 or 2 morph creatures too, especially if the other one was Den Protector, since it had reasonable stats to begin with. So, in addition to those Megamorph decks, it was also played in Dragon Control, Devotion to Green, Collected Company, and Abzan. Like the previous 2 cards though, the Raptor hasn't gained a single point since rotating out of Standard, and it won't be on the list for that much longer. At number 6, it is Shifting Ceratops, which has moved up 1 spot. Like Carnage Tyrant, this is a dinosaur that hates blue mages. For 2 generic and 2 green, the Ceratops is an uncounterable 5/4 with protection from blue, and you can pay 1 green to give it reach, trample, or haste until end of turn. While it has intermittently seen some main deck play, it has seen a lot more play as a sideboard card since it's so great to bring in against blue decks. So far it has points in Standard, Pioneer, Historic, and even Legacy. So far though, it doesn't have any points in 2023, but it probably isn't entirely done just yet. At number 5, it is Rotting Regisaur, which has moved up 3 spots. For 2 generic and a black, the Regisaur is an absolutely massive 7/6. It does come with an ability that can be downside because it makes you discard a card at the beginning of your upkeep. However, one of the things that makes the Regisaur so good is the fact that there are many decks that can turn that effect into upside, and when you've got upside attached to a creature that is this efficient, you're going to be in business. For example, in Standard it was played in decks with Cauldron Familiar and Gutter Bones, both cards that are never going to be staying in your graveyard for very long if you discarded them. In Pioneer, it's been played in Greasefang Parhelion combo decks, which want to get the powerful vehicle into the graveyard so that you can bring it back with Greasefang. The Regisaur can help set you up while also getting in for some serious damage early. It's also found some success in modern dredge decks, which want to put cards like Stinkweed Imp in the graveyard as quickly as possible so that they can fill the graveyard. And it even has a single point from a Legacy Reanimator deck, where it can help you get your Gristlebrand in the graveyard. Rotting Regisaur is likely to keep gaining points, and the top 5 on this list are very tightly grouped, so I think it has a real shot at being the number 1 card on the list at some point. At number 4, it is Zacama Primal Calamity, which didn't make the list last time. This Elder Dinosaur is absolutely massive. For 6 generic, a red, a green, and a white, it gives you a 9/9 with Vigilance, Reach, and Trample, and when it enters the battlefield and you cast it, it untaps all of your lands. And that's important because it has 3 activated abilities you can use those lands for. For 2 generic and a red, it can do 3 to a creature. For 2 generic and a green, it can destroy an artifact or enchantment. And for 2 generic and a white, it can gain you 3 life. It has gained all of its points in a single deck, in a single format. And that deck is Pioneer Lotus Field, which has been on top of the format for the last couple of years. This deck looks to tap and untap Lotus Field a bunch to ramp into crazy stuff, and obviously Zacama is both something crazy to ramp into, and a card that makes your Lotus Fields better because you can untap them. Zacama is usually in the sideboard, but can be fetched with Mastermind's Acquisition when it's the most advantageous win condition for you. It's going to keep gaining points in Pioneer going forward. At number 3, it is Etali Primal Conqueror, the newest dinosaur to make the list. It costs 5 generic and 2 red for a 7/7 trampler that exiles cards from both libraries until a non-land card is revealed, and then it lets you cast those spells for free. In other words, Etali's going to give you a 3-for-1 at first while also possessing a must-kill body. It can also transform into Etali Primal Sickness if you pay 9 generic and a green Phyrexian mana. That is an 11/11 that adds indestructibility, and when it damages players, it gives them that many poison counters. That whole transform part doesn't come up very often in 60-card Constructed, partly because just getting Etali in play is often enough to win you the game before you ever reach that point. So far, all of Etali's points have come in Standard. Before the banning of Fable of the Mirror Breaker and Reckoner Bankbuster, it was usually played in Rakdos control decks that could cheat Etali into play with the cruelty of Gix. But Etali's pretty powerful even when you cast it normally as a control deck win condition, and that's what it's been doing since those bans. It's going to keep gaining points in Standard going forward, and has a decent shot at being the number 1 card on the list in the future, because it's very likely to remain one of the most powerful things you can do in Standard for the foreseeable future. At number 2, it is Rampaging Ferocidon, which was at number 5 last time. For 2 generic and a red, the Ferocidon is a 3/3 with Menace that shuts off life gain, and anytime another creature enters the battlefield, it deals 1 damage to that creature's controller. Obviously enough, the Ferocidon is an excellent aggressive creature, so excellent in fact that it got banned in Standard, since it gave you a great aggro creature that completely turned off life gain, and life gain is usually one of the things that can help keep aggro decks in check, but that wasn't true when the Ferocidon was around. These days, it still sees play in red aggro decks in Pioneer. And at number 1, it's Thrashing Brontodon, which was also number 1 last time. For 1 generic and 2 green, this dinosaur is a 3/4, and you can pay 1 generic and sacrifice it to destroy an artifact or enchantment. You can put it in the main deck in a green aggro deck, and you can end up with a nice creature who has incidental value in some matchups. It's been in Standard a lot since it was printed in Rivals of Ixalan, Core Set 2020, and Core Set 2021, and it's taken advantage of that fact because it has never been played in any other formats. In all of those Standard formats, you could find it in green aggro decks, provided they were viable. That said, it seems inevitable that the active cards on this list will pass it in the future, although I guess we can't entirely disregard the chance that this gets a reprint in Lost Caverns of Ixalan, in which case it will be very likely to see play in Standard again. So those are the top 10 dinosaurs in Magic. If you want to own any of these creatures, check out the description where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each card that appeared in the video. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you want to catch up on past MTG top 10s, including many more that look at creature types, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Lastly, if you want to go the extra mile in supporting me and the channel, you can do that by becoming a channel member or a patron, and you can find ways to do those things in the description. Thanks for watching.